Hello, welcome to Go Library of the Himalaya, Washington Station. This is Dr. Ming. Today, I invite Maura, American journalist, to comment on Western mainstream media. Hello, Maura.
Ni hao. Thank you,
Dr. Thank you, Maura. On the 16th June, the military face-off on the India-China border caused the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and at least 43 Chinese soldiers wounded or died. And there was little reporting of it by the Western media. How do you explain it?
Well, first of all these publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, many papers in England, they all take advertising dollars from the Chinese Communist Party. Every week they have these inserts from China Daily, and it normalizes the CCP. But the other effect of it is that it affects their reporting and the credibility of the choices they make editorial about what stories they're going to cover. And yesterday there was finally a piece in the New York Times by Ed Wong, whom I respect. I think is a very good reporter in the New York Times. But for this is the first one in days, and nightly news, which reaches much more people than newspapers, and MSNBC, CBS, and ABC, all of them, absolutely zero coverage of what's going on with this standoff between China and India at the Tibet border. Again, this is why Tibet matters so much, because Tibet was the buffer between India and China, and that buffer is gone. And instead of having Tibetan pilgrims and traders and lamas at the Indian border, you've got the People's Liberation Army. And so it's very interesting to see how differently this is being covered, of course, in Asian media. Because having been a journalist my whole life, I get a lot of my news sources from Le Monde Diplomatique, which always does better coverage than anything in America, and from Indian, Thai, Japanese, Indonesian, Taiwanese news sources. And of course, I never forget to read Xinhua, China Daily, and Global Times, because you gotta know what the enemy's got to say, right?
Yeah. Next question. Hong Kong police brutality is evidently far worse than that of their American counterpart. So why has the Western mainstream media generally been quiet about Hong Kong police?
That's an excellent question that I have asked myself every single day. I think it's pressure, obviously, that's coming from Beijing and from the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it's really shocking to see that the Western media is not covering the police brutality in Hong Kong. And Mr. Floyd, who was tragically murdered by the police officer, Derek Chauvin. Well, that police officer, Mr. Chauvin, is in jail. He's been charged with murder. And the other police who are his accomplices have also been charged with negligent homicide. There's going to be a trial. There's an outpouring of grief and support for Mr. Floyd's family. But in Hong Kong, you see the same images. You see policemen kneeling with their legs right on the neck of children, of young Chinese children, little girls with their school uniforms and their backpacks. You don't see any criticism of this, and you won't see any of those Hong Kong police tried for murder, for assault, for rape, for any of those things, because it's the CCP in charge. And we know the CCP in China is the only law of the land. And I'm also very upset to see that suddenly, overnight, the movement for racial justice in America, which is terribly important and has gone on since America was created. It has always been a struggle between the abolitionists and the slavers, and these issues continue to this day. But we can openly debate them in this society. We can vote in this society. You can't have an open debate in China. You can't vote in China. You can't charge a policeman for murder in China. They laugh at you. So many of my Tibetan friends who saw their parents tortured to death by Chinese police, do you think they got justice? No. Here's what happens. When your relative and your loved one is shot, they send you the bullet and they make you pay in the CCP. way. I mean, I have many Tibetan friends, so the greatest humiliation was when the CCP sent the bullet that killed my father and made me pay for his execution. But you don't read anything about this in Western media because of the cover-up. I guess those ad dollars really work. They bought silence and complicity, didn't they? It's very disturbing.
So, can you characterize the Western media coverage of the race riots, which is so well funded and has gone global?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's also very suspicious. That I mean, my whole life there have been tragic incidents of police brutality against African Americans, and there have been. I've participated in many protests, peaceful protests, especially in New York City when Mayor Bloomberg increased racial profiling and attacks on young people of color in New York City, my hometown. I participated in a silent march down Fifth Avenue to his home to protest. And there were thousands upon thousands of New Yorkers there. And it didn't get violent. And we also self-funded it. We paid our own way. We made our own signs. Now, suddenly, these protests have gone all over the world. At a time of a great economic crisis, when people say they don't have money, when 40 million Americans are out of work. I witnessed at a protest in New York City 2 weeks ago, suddenly all these people, no social distancing, no masks, a van pulled up in front of the building where I was watching from, and these people got out and they were handing out envelopes, cell phones, and other things, wires to all the protesters. Now, where's all this money coming from? Because in the past, we always self-funded our own work to protest racial injustice in America. And why are there suddenly protests all over Europe? Again, in a time of economic crisis and when we're supposed to be socially distancing. It certainly took the CCP virus out of the front page. Not one mention of China or Hong Kong in the last 3 weeks on the nightly news, which I've watched every night. PBS, which is, the public television, had like 30 seconds on Hong Kong last week, 30 seconds about the law, but that's it. Otherwise, it's slamming America, slamming America, slamming America. Well, America is not the only human rights abuser in the world. As my father said, I do not believe there is any society that is free of sin. But at least in America, we can protest, we can debate, we can criticize our leaders without being afraid that we're going to get a bullet through our heads, or we're not going to be hauled into a black site and tortured to death, which is automatically what will happen to you in the PRC, in the People's Republic of China. So I think it's all very suspicious.
Yeah. So, Comcast, which owns NBS, signed deals with the CCP and is pushing CCP propaganda day and night. Please tell us more.
Again, a lot of this goes back to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which we in the Tibet movement called the Blood Olympics. And we staged global protests around the world to stop the torch relay. Remember, they planned this big global torch relay. They were going to carry the torch around the world. The only other country that ever did that was Nazi Germany. In the Olympics they had in the 1930s, they had a global torch relay. And this only country that ever wanted to do that was the CCP, which of course has many comparisons to Nazi Germany in the lack of freedoms, the one-party control, concentration camps, torture, all those things. And so we were able to embarrass them. And of course, the Tibetan people inside Tibet paid a very high price for this. But nonetheless, what happened was there was an enormous technology transfer of American security firms that had really expanded tremendously after 9/11, because all this money went into the war on terror. And so there's all this money to be made in security, surveillance, and the Chinese government said, we need all of these high-tech surveillance and anti-terror things so we'll have a safe, terror-free Olympics. But what really happened was a massive technology transfer from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, they were all involved. Bill Gates, Microsoft, especially #1 on the list, and giving all of this technology to the CCP, which they kept after the Olympics and used to further enslave and torment and surveil their own citizens. And I didn't see anybody complaining about that except for Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, whom I admire greatly, who's like me. He's one of the few people in America who's always been on the CCP and watching them. He had hearings in 2009 about this. He hauled Microsoft, Google, Yahoo in front of a congressional committee to ask why they're collaborating with the CCP. And they all took the Fifth Amendment, they all, obfuscated, and nothing happened, but at least it's on the record. I feel a lot of our work really has just been documenting the sellout to the CCP. If we can do nothing else, at least we can do that. And a friend of mine who was working for the Washington Post at their Shanghai bureau during the Beijing Olympics, the Blood Olympics, went to a conference in Hawaii in September of 2008. And he called me afterwards. He said, Maura, you cannot believe what happened at this conference. It was for all the Western journalists. And again, this is another way the CCP has bought silence from Western media. Junkets, conferences, we'll pay your way. Come, we're going to have a conference in Chengdu, Shanghai, Beijing, wherever you can shop. We'll put you up. We'll pay your plane fare. And so they all, want to say nice things about the CCP. And I've actually, over the years, been offered, some of these free trips. I have never once taken one. Not once. I was also invited to a conference in Taiwan by a group of people who alleged to be for free China, but I turned it down. I didn't know enough about these people because I know one junket is all it takes. And also, all my friends like Gordon and Lydia Chang, my great friend Gordon Chang, who wrote The Coming Collapse of China, when he goes and manages to get into Shanghai, where his father is from, he doesn't even bring his phone. He doesn't bring his laptop. They leave them in Hong Kong with his wife Lydia's family. So all these journalists who go and they bring their laptop and their phone, well, they're probably got tracking and coding put into those devices, and so that buys their silence, or they get drunk at a banquet and they get photographed in a compromising position. And so my friend who went to the conference in Hawaii in 2008, in September, after the Olympics, said, my God, the whole point of the conference was, how did the Chinese Communist Party feel about their Olympic debut? How did it go? And the Chinese delegation came right out and said, well, those Tibet demonstrators were annoying. And every single day they hung banners that said one world, one dream, free Tibet. And they had other protests going on, but they're gone. And we have all the technology that the American firms gave us. And so we're going to use that to crush Tibet harder, which they did. And who cares about a few dead Tibetans? Because we got what we wanted, because those Tibetan demonstrators were going to make swift work of them. And we have all this technology, so we consider the Beijing Olympics a huge success.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how the CCP wine and dine those Western journalists in exchange for their favorable coverage.
You got it.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to quote something from an open letter to the Chinese government by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post after the CCP expelled their journalists. Mm-hmm. We have prominently featured news and analysis about China's remarkable progress in reducing the spread of the virus through containment and mitigation. Even now, with some of our journalists facing imminent expulsion, they are reporting on how China is mobilizing state resources to develop vaccines that could offer hope to billions of people there and around the world. What's your comment?
Well, that's just collaborating with evil. That just shows which side they're really on. I mean, I've kept a record of how Western media has praised the Chinese Communist Party and repeated their propaganda from day one. They said, oh, there's no new cases in China, no new reported cases. And even as their own journalists and bureaus are getting shut down and kicked out, they're still praising the CCP. Now, this makes me wonder, what does the CCP have on these big media companies? Comcast, back to your original question about Comcast and the CCP. Well, NBC News, which is owned by Comcast, does a great deal of sports reporting. So, of course, it's in their interest to have good relations with the CCP because it's a huge market. The basketball thing last year, remember when the man who was the manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." 7 words that changed the world. Because it exposed, it ripped the mask for most Americans off this collusion. Because the Chinese Communist Party demanded that this man get fired, this poor guy, and it just came out how tight they are with the CCP because they make so much money from sports broadcasting. And so that's why Rachel Maddow is allowed to spread lies about the American government on her show every night and praise the Chinese Communist Party every single night and never cover Hong Kong accurately and just attack America relentlessly and get she's worth $20 million. And she's paid millions of dollars a year. And the things she says are absolutely outrageous and unpatriotic, but she has millions of dollars, and people like me, we can't ever get booked on her show, and we can't ever get hired anywhere because we tell the truth about the CCP.
Yeah. According to the Justice Department, China Daily has paid American media, typically Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Twitter, $19 million in 4 years for advertising and printing. So what is your view?
Well, doesn't that buy silence and complicity? We see it every single day. Because in the old days, what really supported magazines were a lot of department stores. In the old days in New York, it was Saks Fifth Avenue and Macy's and Bergdorf's. They took out the big ads, you know, for women's fashion. And that's all changed, these economic models. And what is also happening in New York, which is very disturbing, is that as the Black Lives Matter protests, which started peacefully and, you know, comes from the tradition of Martin Luther King, the great Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the great African-American preacher and who was committed to nonviolence, like Gandhi and like the Dalai Lama, and whom the Dalai Lama always said he admired greatly. Well, Antifa, which is not a nonviolent movement, has taken advantage of these protests, and all of these department stores in New York are boarded up. They're completely boarded up, and the Democratic leadership, the mayor of New York, Mayor de Blasio, is just completely hopeless. He won't say anything about these protests, but he is allowing millions and millions and millions of people to lose their jobs, lose their income, lose their livelihood, and because he's keeping everything locked up, but he's allowing these protests to continue, but there's no social distancing. So I think, you know, the economic model that a lot of these media groups decided that they were going to bank on was Chinese money. Same in our American university system. And that's also being exposed now that Dr. Charles Lieber, head of the chemistry department at Harvard University, a university professor, which is the highest rank of professor. You get more money, you get more bigger office, everything, had a lab and an apartment in Wuhan and was collaborating secretly for years with the PLA and the CCP on biology, chemistry. God knows if he had a hand in that Wuhan lab. Well, he was just indicted last week, thank God. And it wasn't even reported in the New York Times. And I know a lot of the guys who work at the New York Times, they're all graduates of Harvard, like I am. You know, but unlike me, they all have drunk the CCP Kool-Aid and they repeat CCP propaganda. It's outrageous. So I think we're seeing all this, and it's very frightening because, you know, the elite really they look to the New York Times as being the paper of record. And they don't. One thing I've noticed is that with the CCP virus, I've had so many people who are intelligent Americans, well-educated, sophisticated people, but they didn't really get why China is such a threat because the elites had so normalized the CCP. Have been calling me saying, "Oh my God, Maura, you know, all these years, you know, I didn't take you seriously. I didn't listen. You were right." And I thought those inserts in the New York Times from China Daily were real news. They did. But anybody who knows anything about Chinese propaganda, and again, I'm an expert. Here's another one of my favorites. Modernization the Chinese way. This is from the 70s about how they have to double down on Marxism. This was written after Mao's death. You know, and some people say that China's going to change. It's no longer going to be a socialist, Marxist country, but they're wrong. We're going to continue to be a Marxist state. And so if you read Chinese propaganda, you can see the language, you know, just the syntax and the words they use. But a lot of Americans were fooled by it. They thought it was real news. So I think these media companies have a lot of explaining to do.
In startling contrast to their kowtow into the CCP, the same American press media are nasty to President Trump. So why is that?
Well, they're not doing their jobs because they're showing they're editorializing and they're not reporting the news. And I think another reason they're so tough on him is that he's tough on China. They were not at all tough on George W. Bush when he was starting those dreadful, catastrophic wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that cost our country $7 trillion. And the Afghanistan papers, which came out in November, which exposed what a catastrophe those wars were, how they failed, how they bankrupted our country. That was a one-day story. A one-day story. That's it. That's all it was. But that they just attack Trump relentlessly because Trump is not a Washington insider, and George W. Bush was, and they like to play along with the establishment. They all went along with Bush's war. In fact, Thomas Friedman, the columnist who's attacking Bush day and night, he said, give war a chance about George W. Bush's wars, and he called it Tom's War, the war in Iraq. Well, now he's trying to walk it back a little bit, and he was talking to Steve Bannon about China, and maybe China's a problem. But he attacks Trump relentlessly, because I think the establishment's all embraced China. And I get attacked all the time from these elitists saying, oh, tariffs have been a catastrophe. They've hurt America more. We can't get personal protective gear. We can't get medicine. And I said, well, that's because you guys all sold that out to China, and you outsourced all of our medical supply to China. And they're also not taking this border war between India and China, the Tibet-India-China war of 2020. They're not taking it seriously because they're not getting any information about it, or maybe they just don't want to hear. And you're also seeing more and more that in U.S.-China Business Council, I get their email every day. It's very entertaining reading. You just go on their website, U.S.-China Business Council, sign up for their daily email. Well, they're saying, the Chinese economy is back on track and we're going to continue trying to move factories to China. But I just heard Beijing closed its airport and that there's an outbreak of the virus in Beijing. And so these American journalists and businessmen look stupid when they're going around saying China has it under control. They're doing so much better than America. They no new cases in China. Oh, really? No new cases in China? Well, then why have they closed the airport of a city of 30 million people, the largest city in the world?
Yeah, the lockdowns in Beijing are now residential areas based. Not just the airport, it's closed. Yeah. And also another thing amazed me is that I observed that on separate occasions, 2 out of 3 reporters from within the CCP propaganda outlets, like the CGTN, Phoenix TV, and Shanghai TV, were allowed to attend the White House coronavirus press briefing. So how come this was allowed to happen repetitively?
I can't answer that because I don't work at the White House press office, but it was very, very, very disturbing. And I wonder how many of those people got access during the Obama and the Bush years. But we know, again, it's back to the normalization of the CCP. I remember when the Xinhua built a $50 million headquarters in Washington, and I was writing letters, and I was protesting, and I was asking senators to do something. Nobody did anything. It's like, what's the big deal, Maura? Why should you be concerned? What's wrong with that? And I said, you wouldn't have let TASS have a $50 million headquarters in Washington when the Soviet Union was threatening the United States. So why are you allowing this? And I'm glad that at least President Trump called out that reporter from Phoenix TV and said, who do you work for? Do you work for China? And you could just tell from her questions. You could tell from her poor command of English and all those things. She was definitely CCP. I can always tell someone's CCP. But it just shows their infiltration. And I don't know if they have had their press credentials revoked or not. But I should hope so.
And while you were working with the Radio Free Asia, Libby Liu was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer. What is your comment?
Well, I just really couldn't believe it last night when I opened my inbox and I saw that Michael Pack, who's just been was approved by the Senate 2 weeks ago to head the Broadcasting Board of Governors, has fired her because for 15 years she tortured us at Radio Free Asia. She replaced my first boss, Dick Richter, who was a very distinguished American journalist who did wonderful work. And she fired my colleague and friend Jigme Ngabo, who is head of the Tibet service, because he was doing the best work of his career reporting on the self-immolations in Tibet. And so she sacked him, and I called her up after that. I said, why did you fire Jigme? And she said, oh, well, we wanted to move in a different direction. Well, which direction did they move in? Soft coverage of the CCP. And again, Tibet is their soft spot. Tibet is their weak spot. So you really want to hit them, you hit them at Tibet. The Tibet service is so important for that reason. And so now that she's gone, I couldn't believe it. And also Amanda Bennett is out at Voice of America, which would not let Mr. Miles Guo have an interview, interrupted him in the middle of an interview. And again, you just look at their news coverage of China. It was all soft, 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 soft. And these are taxpayer-funded entities. Now, Libby Lu's father, who came from Taiwan, also was found guilty, and I believe went to jail, for stealing money from the National Institute of Science. And another big story this week, which got very little coverage in the New York Times and mainstream media, was that 54 scientists, Americans, many of them Chinese nationals who became American citizens, were arrested for colluding with and selling secrets to the Chinese Communist Party. So isn't this all very suspicious how this all fits together? But Libby Lu is gone, but we have to take down Caldron Lodro, whom she appointed head of the Tibet service, who's one of her boys, who is detested by all my colleagues at Radio Free Asia and doing a terrible job. He's got to go. Caldron, we're watching you.
Yeah. So Michael Pack is now leading the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And we know that he sacked Amanda Bennett and her deputy. What is your comment about the new leadership of Michael Pack and its expected effect?
Well, he accomplished in 1 week what we couldn't accomplish in 20 years. Because everybody ignored the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Nobody thought it was important. In 2012 and 2013, when Libby Lu was grossly interfering with the Tibet service at Radio Free Asia, the entire Tibet service wrote an open letter to the Inspector General of the State Department. And I wrote letters to senators and to congressmen and people who are tasked with overseeing these taxpayer-funded entities that are supposed to be bringing news and information to communist and authoritarian regimes in Asia, in the CCP sphere of influence. Nobody did anything. I can remember, Dr. Ming, one night I burst into tears and I literally collapsed on the floor of my apartment. I was just so frustrated that nobody seemed to care. And so in 1 week, he's gotten more done than we could do in 20 years of house cleaning, CCP, assets, moles, collaborators. They've got to go. Well, where I wonder, are they all going to get jobs at Xinhua now? Let's see, because we know Xinhua is hiring a lot of Americans in recent years. I've seen a lot of Englishmen and Australians and French people and Americans working for Xinhua as broadcasters, openly. You know, it's not a very well-paid profession, journalism. Working for the government, being a professor, being a journalist, these are not high-paying jobs. And so these people are easily bribed and bought. You know, it's easy to bribe people who don't make a whole lot of money. But yeah, that's again where the collusion of big tech with the CCP is just so utterly criminal, because those are billionaires. Tim Cook, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates are billionaires. And they are definitely on the side of the CCP. Oh, here's another thing I'd like to mention that you and I discussed earlier in email exchanges, is Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, has hired, how do you pronounce her name?
Dr. Fei Li.
Yeah. Dr. Fei Li, who I know Mr. Guo and other sources that I have my Tibetan and Chinese sources say is a CCP registered spy.
Yeah.
And she's an AI expert. Now, how come this is not in the New York Times? How come this is not seen as an issue of concern? How come this isn't on the front page of all the newspapers in America? How come it's normalized? Must be the money, and it must be more than just the money. I really think big tech is on the side of the CCP. You know, they've inducted all these guys into Tsinghua University. You know, Tim Cook and Bill Gates, and they all, you know, if you just Google them, I tell my American friends, you don't believe me, just open your laptop and Google Bill Gates, Tim Cook, China. And you'll see all these pictures of them and Xi Jinping, and earlier on with Jiang Zemin and Li Peng and all the bad boys, you know, smiling, getting awards, you know, and this, it's just out in the open, and no one thinks it's a problem. It's all been normalized. Pardon me, I have to get a little water.
That's fine. Do you have anything else to say about the Western media?
Well, I'm ashamed of them, and you know, none of them would ever hire me because I'm a Tibet person. But I'm glad. I don't want to work for you. I want to know which side you're really on, because if you're on the side of the CCP, you know, history is not going to treat you kindly. I'd rather work for Guo Media.
You're very wise, dear. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Of
for a very brilliant Q&A. I hope to see you very soon.